Let me just say, me and Tom both saw a new soft reboot for an established franchise. And you know, it had its flaws, but at the end of the day, I think it was really good and respectful to the original. Of course, I'm talking about Jurassic World. Now let's talk about Terminator Genisys.
Yeah, clearly.
Terminator Genisys is a piece of shit.
Terminator Genisys? Now what's that?
That movie is gonna suck so much. Yeah, it is. Jesus Christ.
I think the movie was a mess. I'm gonna forget it in a week.
Talk about writing yourself out of a corner.
They tried so hard to make this movie work, and they ended up overcomplicating everything. Convoluted time travel
We had the shameless Star Trek 2009 revamping the timeline movie so we could start all over again.
Dude, this made my dad cry!
The question people often ask me is which movie is worse, this or Dark Fate?
So the question is, was Terminator Genisys really that bad? Yes, yes it was.
This movie made my dad cry! This was a bad movie!
But I actually think Genisys did more damage on the whole, ruining both Sarah Connor.
Bad fan fiction that was somehow greenlit for the big screen. Once again, with Genisys being the worst offender.
I know I'm supposed to look and be like, oh no, not that one, but no, this is the worst. I'm sorry, I'm not following through on that joke. This is the worst one. Period.
Hey, what about me? Well, this video was a long time coming. If you've been sticking around this channel, you'd probably know about my fixation on a shitty reboot from the 2010s, that being 2015's Terminator Genisys. So the question is why? The original video was going to be the 3,000 subscriber special to my channel, as a reference to the T3000. But with the movie turning 10 years old, I feel like it's more fitting to release the video now. The script was made back in 2021, where I was still a frustrated, zealous defender for the film. But over the years, I have grown as a person when it comes to tastes in media. My overall opinions on stuff has evolved to look at works more three-dimensionally. So I went back, touched many things up to give a fully fleshed out detailed response as to why I love this movie. And I'm no slouch either. I did research by reading the art book and watching the feature-length behind-the-scenes documentary that you could only find on the 4K release. Not just because I like the movie, but to also introduce people on the wasted potential, what we could have gotten had the full trilogy been greenlit, and not complaining about how it's yet another movie that copies the first two films. I will be going over everything, from how it was made, the hot button elements that people complain about, to me elaborating on why I believe Genisys is a work of hidden genius. When it comes to discussing any universally panned movie, the common question is, where do you start? Some people would start with the plot and cast, but for me, I'd like to first talk about how we got here in the first place. So let's jump back to 2011, only a few years after the last film, Terminator Salvation. After its release, the series was pretty much silent, despite plans to continue the franchise in a new trilogy. Most fans agree that the series should have ended after the first two movies, despite 3 being a campy 2000s summer blockbuster, and Salvation being able to show a glimpse of the future war, albeit not the same way as the other films. There was also the Fox television drama that gained a cult following, but was ultimately cancelled after 2 seasons. It really seems like the franchise had nowhere left to go. The then franchise holder, Warner Brothers, planned on making the second film in the trilogy by 2010, but with Salvation's abysmal box office and Avatar overshadowing every film from that year, they decided to back out on the idea. Instead, they auctioned off the franchise, for a second time actually, because they already tried to auction it off before Salvation was in production. But this time around, the rights were acquired by Skydance, who are still in a close partnership with Paramount to this day. It turns out, Skydance's founder and CCOs are huge fans of the series, and not only got the rights to everything under one umbrella, but as soon as they did, they went right to work. Coming up with a finalized draft in June 2013, the production only lasted 80 days. In late 2014, a short teaser for the next film in the series was released, Terminator Genisys. Almost immediately, the reception was hated by many, with majority of responses coming from the fans, mainly because it was going to ignore the previous film, start a brand new trilogy, and tell its own story instead of picking up where Salvation left off. Yeah, about that last part. I feel like some people forget that Salvation's storyline did continue and even got a conclusion in the form of a comic run titled The Final Battle. Whether the events in the comic were the original ideas for the planned trilogy, we may never know. But it does run the motions of sending Kyle and a T-800 back in time, and in an unlikely surprise, both the Resistance and Skynet team up to take down a common threat. Sure, there are heavy-fisted callbacks to the first two movies, and some of the writing is off, but it's nice to see a Terminator storyline, have a proper conclusion. This comic felt like a way to appease the fans who wanted the Salvation trilogy to be on the big screen, compromising on what could have been. But I will always find it amusing that people will whine about how Salvation needed a well-deserved trilogy, and yet not realize that it technically does. I guess media illiteracy runs in the community. It's important to note that Genisys has been called a reboot of the Terminator franchise as far back as when it first came out, but I think it's because the term reboot was not as well defined as it is today. Keep in mind that in 2015, the term wasn't commonly used as it is now. The two routes you could do a reboot within that period was either a bland and forgettable modern reimagining of the original film, such as the Total Recall and RoboCop remakes, or telling a new story within a pre-established world but acts more like a remake than being an original concept, such as Prometheus, the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films to an extent, and Jurassic World. This was only mere months before Disney released the Star Wars sequel trilogy, which gave us a refined definition of the term. Remake the same movie but with different characters and iconography, while being within the same continuity of the previous entries. Dark Fate sure as hell was writing down notes with that one. The Force Awakens also leads to new offshoots of reboots, such as legacy sequels, sometimes ignoring sequels and focusing on just the original movie as a template, typically including the original characters as mentors to the new cast. Again, Dark Fate was scribbling down notes with that one too. So what Genisys was trying to do in 2015 was fairly ambitious, bridging the gap between both reboot definitions of the time, becoming a modern remake while also being a creative expansion upon the worlds that was established from the previous films. Not to mention, this was a smart tactic of not only bringing back old fans by telling new stories in a familiar setting, but not gatekeeping newcomers to the fandom, giving them their own movie of action and thrills on the big screen as the legacy fans experienced back in the 80s and 90s. In a way, this tactic was ushering in the next generation of the franchise. I have the belief that Genisys was the movie that new fans actually wanted, and this was heavily implied with the teaser showing a T-1000 in 1984, Kyle Reese being more prominent in the story, big budget future war scenes. Many of these elements from the teaser were shown to younger fans only through home video releases or, God forbid, heavily censored TV edits. They know what these elements are, almost as if they were legends told down by their robotic grandparents, passed down from generation to generation. So now, they get the chance to see these key elements in a new light for once on the big screen, doing something actually new, and not just as hand-me-down stories that the other sequels entailed. Look, I understand 3 and Salvation have their fans, but I don't think either are great. If you strip away the marketing of being a big-budget summer blockbuster and Arnold's last big movie before being governor, Rise of the Machines is tonally inconsistent, a cringeworthy film with cringeworthy moments that ultimately retcon yet retreads Judgment Day at the same time. Did anyone find the scene where the TX imitates a cell phone's reception funny and or sexy? I hope not. If anything, T3 feels more like a parody than it does an actual Terminator film. Arnold gets his clothes from a male stripper, isn't that funny? They even had to remove the Sergeant Candy scene for how goofy it was. Sure, the action is fine, but the CG looks fake as hell and is not in the same caliber as T2's practical set pieces, which again is ruined by the whiplash in tones. When your R-rated Terminator movie that ends with Judgment Day features a gag reel on the DVD release, chances are you're not supposed to take it seriously. And as for Salvation, while the story took place in a future and was overall received a lot better than T3 by fans, it was not the same future war that we've seen in the previous films. The aforementioned box office didn't help the movie, its lead star having a crash out on set, and of course, the hideous CG Arnold clone that left a bad impression on everyone. As this was my first Terminator movie in theaters, I wasn't really wowed by it. Probably because it looked like every other big budget movie that was coming out at the time, and that it wasn't called Avatar. If the movie was called something else, maybe it would have done better. Otherwise, Salvation is fine, but forgettable. And to avoid any bias, I'll jump ahead a bit and explain why I don't like Dark Fate. Admittedly, killing John after the events of T2 is pretty ballsy, but when the outcome is just the same story as the first two movies, there's not a whole lot of intrigue that would make me invested in the new characters and story when they just copy and paste the key elements of what came before. Carl was an interesting asset, but that's really about it. My complaints have nothing to do with the main characters being women. It just wasn't my thing, especially when I preferred Genisys over it. But let's take it back to 2015. It was an uphill battle for Genisys, trying to stand out from the last two movies that didn't go well either critically or financially, but while being the next best thing for the franchise since T2. Despite this, it was still targeted by fans and critics alike. And remember, this is all before the film came out. Between the teaser and the release on July 1st, there were barely any advertisements for the film. All we had was the teaser, 1 or 2 trailers, very few promos, and a cross-promotion with Red Robin. Yeah, that was a thing that happened. When compared to the marketing of Rise, Salvation, and even Dark Fate later on, the marketing went all out for those films, featuring video games, action figures, and dressing your child up as a human-killing robot skeleton. In hindsight, Genisys played the smarter game. By spending less money on marketing, the movie had a lower budget than T3, meaning it was able to make its money back more easily. I think it's because they wanted the movie to be a surprise for the audiences without spoiling anything in the promotional material. Of course, the trailers and posters went on and spoiled the twist anyway, but we'll get to that in a bit. However, the only thing I did see from what little marketing the movie had was just the teaser, and that was more than enough to get me hooked. Maybe because I like to go into movies as blind as possible, avoiding seeing any promo material and not coming across it online, but I went into the film expecting it to be good. And I liked it. I couldn't tell you why, but I thought it was good. So imagine my heartbreak when seeing an endless swarm of people bash this movie into the ground, and not just hate it, despise it. My friend who saw the movie with me was ranting about it on the car ride back home. But after years of reconsideration and finally watching the film again, let's actually address why people constantly miss the point with Genisys and the excuses as to why it sucks. Now, I don't want people who already despise the film to assume that I am a blind defender, because there are a couple of things I do not like about this film. Some of the dialogue is a bit clunky, and most of it is just the characters restating what they are witnessing. Skynet being a pretentious entity constantly lecturing and pestering the heroes at the end is once again very repetitive. And not even I can defend the infamous Bad Boys needle drop right at the end of Act 2. It was out of place in 2015, and it's certainly out of place now. Speaking of music, the song made for the film, Fighting Shadows, is terrible. It is auto-tuned to hell and back, and it tries so hard to be the dubstep version of Sins of the Father. Save your eardrums and don't look it up. But believe it or not, my biggest gripe with the movie is that it sets up genuinely cool stuff that would have been explored in the sequels that we'll never get, which is actually a sign that the movie was enticing enough to people such as myself and served its purpose of giving fans something new while hinting at what was to come. And that's actually all of my complaints I have with the movie, because there is so much good that I would like to share that unfortunately many people have turned a blind eye and unapologetically exclaim that the movie is shit. A primary point of criticism would be the casting decisions. Anyone who has reviewed this film will talk ad nauseum about the movie miscasting beloved characters they grew up with. Early on when the teaser came out, people were already making their digs towards the cast. Honestly, I have zero problems with either the casting or how the characters were written. I think everybody played their part well with what they were giving, and even the documentary states that the actors were casted because they were best suited for the part for this movie's version of these classic characters. And the two characters that will prove my point, or ironically, the two actors that were scrutinized the most, Jai Courtney and Emilia Clarke. Courtney, in a way, plays a more down-to-earth and even humbled Kyle Reese, a soldier that is out of his element when the script is flipped upside down while trying to adapt to a new timeline he is not a part of, showing off a unique side of the character that was never seen before. This Kyle is a stark contrast to the commanding and calculative Michael Biehn from the original, someone who knows his mission and will do whatever it takes to fulfill it. I know everything I'm saying is considered heresy since this is the one guy that everybody hates, but I can assure you that if Michael Biehn's Reese was in this movie, he would probably act the same way as Courtney, confused and frustrated. A common complaint said by many is that Courtney doesn't look anything like Biehn, and I'm always against that statement. Does Michael Fassbender have to look like Sir Ian McKellen to play Magneto? Does Alton Eric have to look exactly like Harrison Ford to play Han Solo? That's the beauty of filmmaking that many people have sadly forgotten these days. Multiple actors can play the same character, yet make it feel like their own. Just because the actors don't look the same, doesn't mean they can't play the same part. Doctor Who has been doing this crap for decades, and nobody complains about that. What's also cool is that Genisys becomes the first Terminator movie that does not feature a Connor as the audience surrogate. In the other movies, the main character is Sarah, John, or an amalgamation of the two characters. Don't get me wrong, Kyle was prominent in the first film, but he was always the Obi-Wan to Sarah's Luke, the outsider that introduces Sarah, and also the audience, about the world and dangers of Skynet. So having Kyle be the audience stand-in here actually makes sense. We know about the world building and stakes by film number 5, so we are right along Kyle when stepping into the new 1984, wanting to know what's going on as well. This will put me in hot water, but I think Jai Courtney is a pretty good actor, even if he's the guy you get when Tom Hardy isn't around. Plus, he was one of the only few redeeming qualities of Suicide Squad, and I was glad to see him return in the sequel, even if they kill him off in the first 5 minutes. At least he died swinging. In addition, Emilia Clarke was a great Sarah. One great change between the first 2 films was how natural the character progression was for Sarah Connor, living her mundane life as a waitress to becoming a brute paranoid soldier. With that arc, it's interesting to see the pieces shuffled around in Genisys, where a T2-esque Sarah is in 1984, how she is accustomed to Terminators always showing up trying to kill her, and defending herself with weapon know-how. Also, I find it wholesome seeing her relationship with Pops, and how he's the closest thing she has to a family. At times, she orders him like a dog, but at the end of the day, the two care for one another. This Sarah, being a younger version of her T2 self, is a lot more snarky and cocky, interacting with others as a defense mechanism. By having a less conservative teen Sarah, I can definitely see where John would get his mannerisms and attitude from in the second film. However, I do feel bad for Clarke. She's always getting cast in garbage, such as Solo, the final season of Game of Thrones, Secret Invasion, and Last Christmas, directed by Paul Feig of Ghostbusters 2016 fame. Even in this particular film, the crew said Clarke trained relentlessly to play the part. All for what? People saying that she was the worst part of the movie in the end? I reasonably understand why she disowns Genisys these days. That being said, I do think this is a great acting showcase for both Courtney and Clark, each portraying multiple emotions, and I really hope they get casted in better films. To close off this section about Clark's performance is that everyone, and I mean everyone, says the same thing about her role. Genisys' Sarah Connor looks like a little girl dressed up as T2's Linda Hamilton. Like, what were you expecting? She was raised by a T-800. All they know is wearing leather jackets. Of course Sarah's gonna look the way she does in Genisys, what with being a rebellious teenager in the 1980s. But a key rebuttal to this absurd complaint is that this is 1984 Sarah Connor. She's 19 years old. Well, technically 20 in Genisys' continuity. The point is, she won't have the build of a fit and muscular 30-year-old woman. What, were you expecting her to be built like a JoJo character? This super buffed out muscular character who's actually 17 years old?
Get real.
I don't recall the actress playing Sarah in the Sarah Connor Chronicles being criticized for not looking exactly like Hamilton, so how come she gets a free pass? People believe that the two actors we did get did not resemble Michael Biehn and or Linda Hamilton, so therefore, they're bad. But personal bias aside, there were many times where I saw the likeness of the original actors with the new cast, either in appearance or in dialogue. Ask yourself this. Did you really expect two people older than 50 rolling around in wheelchairs avoiding explosions? God, only an idiot would think of something like that.
I'll be back.
Speaking of geriatric people, Arnie. What many consider to be the highlight of the movie, and he's certainly up there for me. Acting was never his strongest trait, so seeing him do whatever he wants is always a treat. And you could tell this is the Terminator film where he's having the most fun with. Returning to the role that made him an acting icon after 10 years is bound to be exciting. However, a lot of people do have a problem of Pops being a caretaker to Sarah and unintentionally making jokes. I don't see a problem with this, especially since Pops is the only thing in Sarah's life for over a decade. Of course he would bond with her throughout the years. Look, the concept of a 6-foot-tall muscle robot protecting people is not considered original, but I like the idea of a T-800 being an overprotective father figure to an angsty teen, and it does something new within the good guy dynamic, actively caring for their target as a person that they can attach to. Now before you say, Terminators should be mindless killing machines that shouldn't care about human emotions. Well, what about Uncle Bob from T2? I thought everyone liked him. Rather than killing humans, he gets to study and understands them. This scene?
I know now why you cry, but it's something I can never do.
Pops is in the exact same boat, just more time has passed interacting with humans. Uncle Bob had what, at least 48 hours to get a glimpse of what humans are like, compared to Pops who spent decades being around them? Pops also has his own character arc of still kicking ass despite being an outclassed model. With the phrase old but not obsolete, I interpret that as how certain elements can be reused, but in no way does that mean it's a bad thing. Concluding with him getting upgrades of using T-1000 abilities, which is awesome. His other character arc of trusting Kyle and vice versa is also interesting, since this is Kyle's first time being acquainted by a Terminator who sides with the Resistance, ending with the two being on friendlier ground, and Pops trusting Kyle that he can take care of Sarah if needed. Wrapping up the other casting choices, I thought Jason Clarke was great as John Connor, being able to play two different versions of the same character while making it feel like it's the same person. In fact, what this movie does with John is so interesting that I'll be saving it later on in a future section. Matt Smith was a unique interpretation for the human embodiment of Skynet. It sucks that he doesn't show up much in the movie, because he would have absolutely killed it in the role had we got the trilogy. On the topic of personifying a mindless machine, I like the idea of Skynet acting with a singular conscience, trying to replicate the thing that it will never become. But also, let's face it, we like to see three-dimensional villains bantering with our heroes. Blame the Avengers for that, not me. Now, Terminator isn't a franchise known for having memorable secondary characters. Sure, there's Dyson in 2, but that's about it, especially when majority of his scenes are in the third act. So that's why O'Brien, played by J.K. Simmons, is a welcome addition to the series. One of the police officers that Kyle encounters and saves in the shopping mall that's later running around trying to get the feds' attention in 2017. Honestly, having someone who knows about the machines outside of the main cast is something that we should have had by now, so a character like O'Brien was a long time coming. Not to mention, it's nice to finally see a side character in these movies that's actively trying to help the heroes, instead of being either in denial or disappearing once they serve to their purpose. A part of me wonders if the character trait of O'Brien having his conspiracy characteristics would be something later used for Jameson in the MCU. That or farmers insurance.
We are farmers. Bum, 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 bum.
Aside from the cast, the other big flaw people have with Genisys is the story. And honestly, the story is one of the best parts of the film. It has engaging action set pieces, slow moments when needed, and most importantly, a breath of fresh air in this franchise that has been milked dry since 1991. The act of breaking a predetermined cycle and entering into a new undetermined path is a great way to move on from everything that had been done before. In many places, the film feels like a big budget fan film, having creative ideas based off the older films in a 2-hour action movie. Which is actually not far from the truth. Not only were the higher-ups of Skydance fans and heavily involved in the production, but many other staff members of the crew were also fans as well. And from the behind-the-scenes documentary, it seems like everyone in the project wanted to do this film justice, using what came before as points of reference to build up something new. No wonder why so many critics didn't get Genisys. It truly was a film for the fans by the fans. I think the movie does a solid job trying to explain everything it could without causing a problem as quickly as possible. Hell, Pops not only explains what's going on, but he rephrases it again in broader English. Do people in this fandom really have media illiteracy? I was joking before. With all of the criticisms the movie gets, I'm actually shocked nobody complains that the movie pushes any agenda. If they did say Sarah in this film being strong, independent, and badass as a complaint, they would look like total hypocrites. I'm guessing it was because this came out right before Ghostbusters 2016, where all of the woke movie bad complaints really started to take off, and Dark Fate being a target in that field. But the biggest contribution on why the story worked more importantly was that James Cameron had no hands-on activity in the production. He only acted as a spiritual advisor to the writers, and he insisted that the movie needed Arnold's return. It just goes to show that when Cameron produced Dark Fate, and again marked the start of a new trilogy, that didn't go anywhere. There's also his comment saying Genisys is the true Terminator 3, but I would disagree with that. Not only because he said the exact same thing with Dark Fate, but if Genisys wanted to be its own thing outside of the two movies, placing a big number 3 creates a false description on what the movie really is. Look, I know people prefer to have the original director make reboots and remakes since it's their original vision of the world that they created, but not everyone is a George Lucas, and even he went too far in a few places. So, in my original script, I was going to call James Cameron senile and that he has no idea what he's doing. I also said in the original version that Avatar 2 was never gonna happen. Not only did Avatar 2 happen, but Avatar 3 is right around the corner. So, yeah. Lastly, I want to bring up the infamous clip where he says he starts to see things that he recognized. So many people take this one quote out of context, almost as if it is the main thesis for why the movie was bad. But what is left out of the clip is how Cameron says he was almost fanboying when seeing the movie, concluding that he did indeed enjoy the movie. Not only did he praise the casting of the characters, but he stated that Genisys had a good story and that it made sense. And that perfectly segues into the time travel elements, another great part of the plot. While it was a prominent plot device in the previous films, we never actually saw any time machines on screen, nor was it really explored to the full potential as it is in Genisys. So it was a nice change of pace to see a Terminator film be about time travel rather than a Skynet model traveling back in time. We get to see both time traveling from the past and future, as well as how things are in each time period. A lot of people don't like how the film mostly takes place in 2017 as a forced way of having Kyle and Sarah be in the modern era, but considering how we had a Terminator movie in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, making this take place in the 2010s was the next logical step. This also leads into the movie's concern with rising technology. Instead of the fear of nuclear war leading to the rise of robots in the first two movies, Genisys is a digital cloud that can be used on any device, and how we are okay with invasive technology on our front doorstep, with everyone in 2017 glued to one device or another. It relays the growing threats of technology becoming more advanced beyond human control, a message that has been with the series since 1984. And with how fast technology is moving these days, it's scarily prophetic. Even though I dislike the other films, they still keep the social commentary of the increase in technology and artificial intelligence in our daily lives, and how mankind loses relevancy in the world. Some people also complained that if the heroes had a time machine and they knew when Genisys was going to launch, why didn't they travel earlier in 2017 instead of right before it being launched? I don't know. Maybe it's because we wouldn't have a movie? Maybe we wouldn't have a ticking clock element? Besides, I don't think stopping Genisys sooner would have made a difference. John still would have helped accelerate Skynet's AI regardless, rapidly ticking down the timer to only a few minutes until Genisys' launch. But with the relied use of time displacement devices, this also leads into what many consider to be a major problem with the story, and the ultimate bastardization of the franchise, to which I will gladly debunk. The time travel. I understand it. And no, this is not played for comedic purposes. Other people have done that part for me. As I am probably one of the only few people in the world that gives a shit about this movie, I can understand the time travel debacle as a reward for my investment. I got a good handling on the explanation the movie throws during my first viewing, and an even better understanding after a rewatch. Mainly because this movie actually goes out of its way to explain the timeline shift. I guess people were busy bitching about the movie by the time they got to that part, huh? Anyway, the timeline confusion is not that difficult, and is almost as exaggerated as the complicated timeline of the Kingdom Hearts franchise. So today, I, AJ, holding a master's degree of time travel logic in science fiction movies, will be explaining to you the timeline shift of Terminator Genisys. The movie starts with the future war in 2038. Kyle states that Judgment Day happens on August 29, 1997, the original date. However, the movie later retcons the date to be October 2017, once Kyle enters into another timeline of the Genisys universe, after a crucial moment that is altered within the nexus point of time travel. And yes, you heard me right, the Genisys universe, not the main universe. And to understand this, we need to talk about parallel universes. One thing that needs to be noted right away is that this is not the same universe as everything else in the series. Each universe is consisted of multiple timelines. So for the main universe, Terminators 1 through 3, Salvation and Dark Fate take place in one universe, but having several timelines that all stem from the events of T2. Hence why those films keep making direct references to events of the first two movies. Genisys is the real oddball as it takes place in its own universe, but to compensate, this one film has multiple timelines. With this being a parallel to the main universe, it explains why Genisys' 1984 is not identical to T1's. They share the same structure, but there are some minor alterations. A relatively small difference is, like I said before, Sarah's age. In the original universe, she's 19 in 1984, but here she's 20. This also explains how time travel rules may be different in Genisys' universe as opposed to the main continuity. The 1984 Kyle goes to here is not the same timeline he was living in, explaining how he begins to form new memories of a childhood he never had. Side note, I kinda wonder if that's why John didn't send any more humans after his father in T1. It could possibly mess up the person's psyche, adding in new memories they never had, and quite possibly jeopardizing the mission. We do kind of see the after effect in one of the deleted scenes in the first film. Now, why did I say that Judgment Day happened in 1997 when the movie later said it was 2017? This is where the multiple timelines come in. It's almost guaranteed that Judgment Day can happen at a different time in different timelines. Look at T3. It takes place in the main universe, but it is placed in a different timeline from the other films where they have different end dates. Now, Genisys initially is shown to have a contradicting way of explaining the new timeline. Sarah, and even John, exclaims that all previous timelines had been erased. But Pops gives a more precise explanation. When Skynet killed John, it created a dramatic shift to the timeline that Kyle was being sent to. As this crucial event of the war occurred near the nexus point, or the core of the timeline, the predetermined destined path for the 2017 timeline had been dramatically altered. So originally, Kyle was going to be sent to one timeline, but instead was sent to another created from this event. With John not being the new resistance leader in the offshoot timeline, it also changed other events, such as Kyle living a normal life, a T-1000 being sent in 1973 and to 1984, and a Guardian protecting Sarah at a young age. Now before you say, but what about when they traveled to 2017? Shouldn't they be in a different timeline than the one they came from? Traveling to a different timeline only happens when you're going into the past. Going forward in time is just that, going into the future of that timeline that's already been established. If you go to the past, you would create another timeline than the one you're in. The rules are kind of similar to the ones that are in Back to the Future. And in a way, that's always been Skynet's shtick, sending machines back in time to create different timelines, different ways of how it was built, and even at one point, killing people that will destroy Skynet in the future. I mean, the crushed T-800 arm and computer chip at the end of the first movie that would lead into Cyberdyne's creation is something I doubt happened in the original timeline before the events of T1. And if you're still in the belief that Genisys erases the existence of the first two movies because Genisys is in the same universe as everything else, allow me to share key evidence that rebukes that belief. The Sarah Connor photo. Every other time we have seen this photo, it has always been the original Linda Hamilton one from the first film. But Genisys does something extremely interesting by using a new photo, this time having Amelia Clark in the picture, indicating that this is a different universe and continuity from the other films. Plus, in the first movie, that photograph was shown being destroyed in a flashback, whereas here, Kyle still holds onto it before he leaves. Other small inclusions being that Dyson is played by another actor, and the droning horns of the T-1000 theme are noticeably different than in T2, yet still retains the same motif. And guess what? We're done! That's the entire timeline debacle of Terminator Genisys.
Alternate timelines are not complicated.
I know there is stuff I didn't add, like how Pops is in this timeline and who sent him, and why is there a T-1000 in 1984, but once again, those two were from a different timeline within the Genisys universe that just so happened to be sent in the same timeline Kyle was thrown into following the Nexus shift. Now I know I keep calling this a parallel universe with basically no proof, But in the documentary, the way the producers and writers refer to the new continuity is fascinating. They do not want to start over again through a reboot, but rather tell an alternate story that works in concert to the original films, with Genisys being a different take on the key elements of the franchise. They never flat out state that this is a parallel universe, but how they refer to it directly implies that it is. Going back to Skynet, I'm pretty sure that's the reason why they wanted to make their arch nemesis begin to work for them. To go into another timeline and mess everything up for the good guys and make Judgment Day happen with bigger, more technological advantages. Which is why Kyle tells his younger self to warn about the dangers of Skynet at the end of the film, as a premonition of what's to come. A world where everything is flipped on its head, including his commander. And that leads to the best part of the film. This movie's interpretation of John Connor is so interesting that it makes sense to lead into the creation of the T-3000. Here's an icebreaker to start the conversation. I had no idea about this reveal prior to my first viewing. I only saw the teaser, and that thankfully did not spoil the reveal. Revealing the twist in the trailer was most definitely a studio decision, since even the director was warning people not to watch it. Had I did watch the trailer, however, I probably would have said, holy shit, this is the coolest thing ever. And when I did see the twist in theaters, I said, holy shit, this is the coolest thing ever. Before people say this was a bad twist and I'm stupid for liking it, let me remind you, this isn't the first Terminator movie that had its twist spoiled in the trailers and promotional material. Have you forgotten about the marketing for T2? Almost everything about that movie spoils the twist before people saw it. There was the teaser that only showed the T-800 being manufactured, but the full-length trailer basically gives everything away. How Arnold was playing the good guy, he was sent back to save John and Sarah, and that the T-1000 was liquid metal. And if that didn't spoil the twist, the countless toys and promotional material would have given it away regardless. The documentary also considers this twist as the inverse of the one in T2. There, it was the bad guy being the good guy, and here, it's the other way around. And honestly, making John Connor a Terminator was a genius idea. Think about it. If they didn't make John the T-3000, what was gonna happen? A Terminator chasing the Connors? Again? And while John is loyal to Skynet, it adds some tension and dynamic characteristics and moments with Sarah and Kyle, in denial that they could save him. And even if John did fulfill his mission of killing his parents, he would cease to exist. In fact, they point that out in the movie. However, I don't think it would be a problem, since there would always be a timeline where Sarah and Kyle conceived John. And later on, John exclaims that if Pops lets him kill Sarah, he would cease to exist. So I think there was truth to that part instead of the conversation in the parking lot. Who knows, maybe that was part of Skynet's plan all along, having the Connors kill themselves, leaving Skynet not to worry about future leaders trying to take it down. Like I said, this movie is a work of hidden genius. Oh, and one more thing, the idea of John becoming a Terminator, yeah, that was something that also happened in Salvation's comic. Just let that sink in. Another thing the movie does so well is how they portray John as a morally gray character, even before he flips sides. We were always told about how great John was as a leader, a messiah to the resistance that would take down the machines. But when you really think of what John is doing, it's pretty messed up. John basically sends his father back in time just to die in order for him to be born, not telling Kyle what his ultimate purpose is in the war. We can even see Kyle becoming confused and betrayed when he finds out he was initially being sent back in time to his grave. It's even worse when you factor that John was destined to be born into leading a war, training rigorously by his mother and calculating every minute thing in order to reach the outcome that he was destined to have. And so when Skynet gives him the chance to be a machine, to walk the path that he was chosen for, he instantly takes it. Of course, he is still under the control of Skynet through an inhibitor chip, as described in the book, but I'm sure that would have been explored at large in the sequels, because honestly, Robo-John is really cool. The T-3000 is the best Terminator model since the T-1000. The T-X was embarrassing to look at whenever she was on screen, and the T-Rip inside Marcus was never really the big eye-catcher of Salvation. The T-3000, however, rectifies all of that by being the best of both worlds of the T-800 and 1000, while also paying respect to each. Ironic, since the beginning of the film features our heroes fight both a T-800 and 1000 back to back, and in the end, fighting a Terminator that has both of those models' abilities. The T-3000 also has something the other machines don't, a proper human component, the perfect symbiosis between man and machine. Whenever he was on screen, he looked menacing and highly intelligent, aside from the fact that he's John frickin' Connor. He has all of the T-1000 abilities and more due to his nanotechnology, making him teleport, form weapons, shapeshift, and regenerate at a faster pace than liquid alloy. But he also retains an endoskeleton much like the T-800, and I gotta say, I love the endoskeleton. It feels like a modern upgrade from the iconic T-800 endoskeleton. To me, the T-800 is peak monster movie design. It reaches the uncanny valley of a human skeleton coated in silver metal with red eyes, something that realistically should not be walking around without skin. The T-3000, on the other hand, while not as threatening as the T-800 physically, still shares the stressful concept of a T-1000 morphing into anyone and killing their target silent yet painfully. I also love how his endoskeleton design was based off of the human muscle system, which again acts like an upgrade as it is the next layer of the human body following the skeleton, which once again spikes itself into the uncanny valley. I'd say this is a worthy successor to the T-800, a much better modern upgrade to a classic 1980s monster design than whatever the hell the Predator had in its 2018 reboot. I'd like to believe that the guys from Stranger Things saw this design, loved it, and used it as the basis for Vecna. They look really similar. Despite how unstoppable he sounds, the T-3000 has one weakness: magnets.
Fucking magnets, how do they work?
I initially hated this weakness because it seemed more like a plot convenience. Hell, our heroes find out about his weakness by freak accident, and early on in the film nonetheless. Pops also has his magnetic gloves that help disable the nanosites around John's body, and he is basically stopped once it goes right through him. But as I think about it, yeah, it kinda makes sense. Magnets can disrupt the rapid flow of nanoscopic machines moving around, so magnets being a weakness gets a pass for me. To wrap this up, the T-3000 is such a cool villain with a cool design to boot, and is a neat parallel to Darth Vader of all people. Both characters being chosen ones who started as annoying kids, to horny and awkward teenagers, to being war generals, to an ultimate badass serving under the rule of their former enemy. Not to mention, they both have weaknesses that tie to their appearances. The only difference is that Vader didn't get retconned into oblivion unlike the T-3000. Actually, that would be funny if at the beginning of a Star Wars film, it starts at the celebration of Naboo, and out of nowhere, Darth Maul shows up with no legs, cuts Anakin's head off, and then the film jumps into The Force Awakens. Yeah, that's what Dark Fate feels like. And now, my friends, we are on the last major criticism that everyone bitches about the movie, the fan service. And without a doubt, this is the one thing everybody misinterprets of this film. Now, the usage of fan service in general is really tricky to get right. When it works, it feels satisfying and rewarding to longtime viewers. And when it doesn't, it feels forced and pandering. A lot of people actually confuse the term of bad fan service with sequelitis, where the same scenes and lines from the first film are repeated in sequels without any difference. However, there is a difference between fan service and hallmarks, especially if your movie is in a long-running franchise. And this is where people always believe that Genisys is a disgrace and mockery to the Terminator franchise. The scenes in the movie that you think are saying, hey, remember this scene from T1 and 2, we're doing it again, is actually a genuine nod to the original films rather than a cheap imitation of what came before. As I mentioned, Genisys is a parallel universe to the original 2 films, so it's natural a lot of those beats will be repeated in this film, but not in the same way. Let's start off with the most common use of fan service, Pop's smiling. Initially, it is played for comedic effect. A lot of people would call this cringe, but in actuality, it's a neat little reference to one of the deleted scenes found in T2's Special Edition, where John encourages Uncle Bob to smile. I think this is a very fitting move to add into Genisys since it's fan service done right, for people who know about the Special Edition of T2. Not to mention, it makes sense story-wise, considering the fact that Sarah has been living with Pops for over 10 years, and probably had a trauma seeing her parents die in front of her by T-1000. So having Pops, the only thing comforting Sarah, smiling under her orders, would give her a sense of joy and optimism while growing up. Only for Sarah's teenage angst to find it embarrassing. I mean, she's not wrong, he does look silly when he does it. Speaking of the T-1000, many people were either confused or hated the idea of one not only showing up in 1984, but again wearing a police uniform and having the same mannerisms as the one from T2. But this could also be interpreted as a nod to Cameron's original vision. He wanted a T-1000 in the first movie, but it was impossible because he didn't have the money for it and the technology wasn't there. So seeing it here feels like what Cameron originally envisioned, paying respect to it and serving as a gateway to remind audiences of the original films without pandering too much. It's somewhat implied that the T-1000 that attacked Sarah in the 70s is the same one that we see in 1984, which kinda makes sense. And as for this T-1000 also being a police officer, I mean, police officers are a high ranking of authority, the perfect method to gather vital information on a target for an infiltration unit. Plus, no sane person is going out of their way to attack a police officer. Do I have to remind you that every single T-800 that has been seen with skin is always a Model 101, wears either a leather jacket and or sunglasses, and always carries around a shotgun? If you want to play that game, I'll play it. Another misunderstanding of the fan service is all of the reused lines throughout the film. I can never understand why people would hate it when a Terminator property uses the lines of "get down," "come with me if you want to live," "I'll be back," or "get out." In fact, when I saw this film with a friend, as soon as Arnold said "I'll be back" and then the Terminator theme started to blare, he got up and left the theater. But he came back because I was still there. And that's because I don't have a problem with these lines being reused, as they are hallmarks to the franchise. You need these lines, as they are important to the series. They are just as important as "May the Force be with you" and "I got a bad feeling about this" for any Star Wars project. Same goes for plot structures being recycled from the previous movies. When people discuss the Terminator sequels, they will always say every movie after 2, except Salvation, repeats the same plot. Did we watch the same movie? Because Genisys clearly does not repeat that much of T1 and 2 in the exact order. Hell, this movie ends with that cycle being broken and enters into a new path. People didn't like how the heroes had to destroy Cyberdyne before the launch of Judgment Day, much like in T2. But may I remind you that in Star Wars, the original trilogy, they blow up 2 Death Stars, and nobody had a problem with that. Not to mention that T2 itself heavily lifts many elements from T1 in the same order nonetheless. Both films end with a car chase on a highway, leading to a final confrontation inside an industrial building. Heck, you can even argue these same plot beats are also recycled in Genisys, twice, and yet each set piece feels fresh and distinct from one another. Not to mention, I feel like initially making references to the first two movies, especially in the first half, was done intentionally. The 1984 segment feels more like a loose recap of the first two Terminator movies, with some alterations here and there. The opening shots of T1 being replicated, a police officer T1000, Sarah being a badass, and so on, are fresh reminders to moviegoers about the first two movies in a quickly digested scene that clocks in at under 30 minutes. And then, the rest of the film goes off into its original story that it wants to tell, bringing audiences along for the ride. And Terminator is not the only franchise that does this. Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness recreate scenes from the previous films, both of which use new footage and different actors as a recap, filling the audience with context before getting into that film's story. Granted, the reason for the retelling was how different studios didn't have the rights to the previous installments, but it still follows the same practice. However, Genisys follows this practice differently, as it is set in a parallel universe. By starting in a familiar location with tweaked and alternate elements of key components, it allows the creation of an original story that leads into a new path. In fact, so many other IPs and franchises have done just that. So I want to briefly discuss them and show how hypocritical it is that Genisys is misunderstood as a reboot and not a parallel universe when other properties have no problems with it. And the first comparison I would like to bring up might sound like a stretch, but I can assure you it's worth it. Neon Genesis Evangelion. Is it wise to compare Terminator to something as intellectual as Evangelion? Nope. But I'm doing it anyway. So, Evangelion, one of the most influential anime series of the 90s, sporting a ton of merchandise. In 2008, the first of 4 feature-length films were released. These were known as the Rebuilds films. Rebuilds 1.0 is verbatim a shot-by-shot reenactment of the first 6 episodes of the anime with some slight differences. However, starting with the second film, it becomes apparent that this is not the same story as the anime, adding in new characters, altering certain characters, and changing the plot structure. It is later revealed that the Rebuilds movies are in a parallel universe to the original Evangelion universe. Or it's a different time loop. I don't know, Hideki Anno was weird. Sure, many shots and moments are identical to the anime, but the movie tells their own story while paying respect to what came before. To a lesser extent, the manga too is also a parallel universe, whilst being more closer to the anime. This is almost the exact same route that Genisys takes, familiarizing fans with the previous films, reenacting both T1 and 2 in certain places, and enticing the audiences with new and intricate stories using the same characters within a pre-established world. And so many other franchises have also took the same approach with installments in a parallel universe to the original story. I already brought up X-Men before, and those movies later enter into a separate continuity. Despite First Class reenacting the opening Auschwitz scene from the first movie, it instead tells its own story using younger versions of the characters the audiences are used to, later messing around with time travel and multiverses in the following installment. Bringing up JoJo again, following the reset of the original universe in Part 6, Part 7 starts the franchise in a brand new parallel universe, with an alternate take of Part 1, this time taking place in the Wild West, rather than in England, using Americanized versions of key characters and featuring cowboys and stands, neither of which being present in Phantom Blood. The same could be said for Part 8, again, having similar elements to the original universe in the form of Part 4, but being totally different from its predecessor at the end of the day. While it is implied to be a remake, the Final Fantasy Remake trilogy is actually a parallel universe, despite sharing a similar structure to the original game. The remake trilogy explores the possibility of defying a predetermined fate that was set from the original story, with every alternative decision creating another parallel universe in its place, as well as several what-if scenarios. Mortal Kombat 1 is also a parallel universe in the sense that it restarts everything from Mortal Kombat 11, which in turn the NetherRealm trilogy was also a parallel universe to the original Midway games, but all of them having similar elements that still occur regardless to the outside forces, even having its conclusion be parallel to Mortal Kombat Armageddon that depicts several multiverses of bizarro mashups of several fighters as one character. Hell, just recently, Mobile Suit Gundam threw their hat in the parallel universe ring with their new series, a what-if scenario of the original series that starts on familiar ground but drastically spirals into something new. And also, one of the showrunners for this series was Hideki Anno, the same guy that gave us Evangelion and the Rebuild movies.
How about that?
Many of these franchises have gone on to be praised for their successes, to various degrees, but they are all respected for being different from the original predecessor. All of this ties back to a burning question. If these franchises were able to continue developing their Elseworld stories, why can't Terminator do the same? Now that we went over the story, characters, and everything else in between, we must ask ourselves, why did people rip this movie to shreds and not give it a chance ever since 2015? There's even people that still believe that Genisys is worse than Dark Fate. Rotten Tomatoes not only gave Dark Fate a higher score than Genisys in both the tomato meter and audience score, but the film is fresh, which I can't see how anyone would think this. I guess it's just a matter of preference, the same way how there are some people that prefer The Rise of Skywalker over Last Jedi. But even when compared to the other sequels, why did Genisys get so much hate, whereas T3 and Salvation barely got any criticism? That question could be answered by a simple, singular word: the internet.
You're going surfing on the internet.
Keep in mind that in 2003, there was no YouTube, so video sites where people could review movies fresh out of theaters was almost a rarity. All people had were internet review articles and forum boards, but also not too many people would read off reviews online when magazines and newspapers were still the dominant form of getting information. Now when Salvation came out, yes, YouTube was around, but 2009 was still during the site's infancy, where nobody exactly knew what to do or how to use the site. For that reason, movie reviews didn't make a big splash, since the biggest trends on YouTube was either becoming a ripoff of the Angry Video Game Nerd or shitting on Justin Bieber. That's all we did during our free time back then. So when people reviewed Salvation, the movie review process on YouTube wasn't nearly as polished as it is now. It also didn't help that videos had to be under 10 minutes. So many of the reviews were mostly positive and barely elaborated those comments within a strict time limit. By the time Genisys came out, however, the movie review metagame was already established online, with there being a surplus of online reviewers who were known for covering bad movies. They took Genisys as an easy target since the movie itself is based off of a classic IP, and with the previous impressions from 3 and Salvation, they proceeded to bash the film over the head with a frying pan without any second thought or consideration, and Lord knows they beat it to a pulp. But there is also another reason why so many people didn't give Genisys a chance, and that's the time period when this movie was released. Going back to the beginning of the video, Genisys was released in the era of movie reboots and remakes, the 2010s. Not only that, it was smack dab in the middle of the decade and in the middle of the year, at a time when the term wasn't really well defined. By that point, people were starting to get tired of reboots of movies from the 80s and 90s. Let's take a look at the list of reboots before and after Genisys, shall we? Before it, there was Prometheus, that did decent enough to get a sequel in 2017, a prequel to the Aliens franchise. As mentioned before, there was the lousy and bad Total Recall and RoboCop remakes, the praised yet forgotten Evil Dead reboot in 2013, Jurassic Park having a reboot the same summer as Genisys, the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies that veered a different path from the original series and main universe. Not to mention, the third film was already announced for the following year, a 2014 Godzilla movie that would jumpstart a cinematic universe of giant monsters here in the United States, not to be confused with Japan's independent Godzilla film franchise, which would share no connections, the Hobbit trilogy being a prequel to the Lord of the Rings movies, Fury Road becoming an unexpected juggernaut reboot to the Mad Max series, and 2 of the 3 movies in the Planet of the Apes reboot trilogy was already out. And following Genisys, with the release of the Star Wars sequel trilogy, there were even more reboots on the way. The 2016 Ghostbusters reboot that was immediately hated by the teaser alone, the DC Extended Universe would struggle to release Batman v Superman alongside DC's never-ending attempt to try and copy Marvel's success with their cinematic universe by making movies that nobody asked for. Speaking of Marvel, Sony released the Amazing Spider-Man films and planned to make their own cinematic universe. But with the mixed to negative receptions of the second film, Sony cancelled all of their plans, and within the span of 2 years, another actor played the role of Peter Parker in the MCU. There was also the atrocious Fantastic Four 2015 reboot, and the X-Men reboot movies diminishing in quality following Days of Future Past. There was also Creed, which was a reboot/legacy sequel to the Rocky franchise, likewise Halloween following the same path. And by 2015, there were already small talks of Universal creating a cinematic universe of their monsters, which would ultimately bomb within their first attempt. Not to mention the endless sea of Disney live-action remakes throughout the entire decade. And there's plenty of other bad reboots that came out before and after Genisys within the decade that had inevitably become obscure and or forgotten. So by 2015, people were having enough with reboot movies, and Genisys was the final straw for a lot of people. They did not care for the original story elements that the film was exploring. If it looked or sounded like a cheap imitation of the first 2 movies, it was going to automatically fail because it was a quote-unquote reboot. To be honest, if Genisys was released before or even after 2015, I think the movie would have had a chance. Don't get me wrong, people will rip the film to shreds regardless because they don't have anything else better to do with their lives. But I do believe there would have been more people defending the film. It's just another one of those wrong places at the wrong time type of movies. The movie basically had everything going for it, and if us Americans didn't like it, I can assure you that the lands in the East most certainly did. I always find Asia's fascination with the Terminator franchise to be interesting. In a sense, it seems like Asian countries like China, Japan, and Korea have a better understanding of the franchise. Ironic since we made the damn thing in the first place. But it's kind of understandable. Humanoid robots is up their alley. Not just that, but it seems that in Japan, the franchise is well respected there. Universal Studios Japan was the last Universal park to hold the Terminator 2 3D ride, while it was closed everywhere else. Plus, we did get an anime on Netflix based on the series, and that turned out to be great. Hell, many of the parallel universe examples I brought up come from Japanese origin. And of course, by looking at the box office, Genisys made more money internationally than here domestically. But realistically, it makes sense when you compare the population of both continents. In fact, there is a possibility that Genisys could have made more money. A 2015 article reports several screenings for Genisys being removed in Chinese theaters in favor of more screenings for a war propaganda film. As a result, Genisys was alleged a target of box office fraud, and the loss of additional revenue in China. I think if it did regain that money, we would have seen at least a sequel or two. Now, a cynical, skeptical person could say that Genisys was intentionally targeting an Oriental audience by having the T-1000 be played by a Korean actor, the tie-in song Fighting Shadows was sung by a Chinese singer, with a feature by Big Fucking Sean, and that by hiring younger actors, Asian markets could easily promote the movie. However, the Asian influences in this movie is not so much of pandering to a specific demographic, but rather acknowledging fans overseas and respecting them the same way the fans there respect the series. Because have you seen how we treat the franchise? I have tried to hold my temper in this video up until now. I haven't tried to go after anyone in particular and made some jokes about media illiteracy here and there, but if something is going to change within this fan community, someone needs to step up and open their voice. The seething bigotry and hypocrisy that exists is something that I cannot remain silent about. While this video has only targeted those who hate the film and misunderstood it, it led me down a rabbit hole on why things are the way they are in this community. And my studies have shown that this community is nothing but boomers. Middle-aged viewers of the first two movies that do not like anything that looks like it is repeating the first two movies, only to then trash anything that tries to do something new and original, saying that it's not like the first two movies, but then go right back to hating the next movie that is intentionally trying to be like the first two movies. In fact, the whole nuclear war threat that was the foundational idea for the advent of Skynet in the first two movies were originally fears of the baby boomer generation. It all ties back around when you think about it. They are so self-entitled and pompous, bolstering how T2 is hailed as the greatest action movie ever made, and anything that comes after it is automatically inferior. They are so entitled that my copy of T2 has 3 versions, 2 of which being the special edition, with the only change being that one has the alternate ending and the other has the theatrical ending. It almost feels like the fans bullied the DVD manufacturers to make one minute change in the special edition because they are the real fans of the greatest action movie ever made. These are the same geniuses that claim that the films should have ended with 2, and that should be the end of all Terminator content. Newsflash, this is a science fiction movie. It's almost guaranteed to become a franchise. To quote Stu Mocker,
"These days, you gotta have a sequel."
There are so many movies that should have been one movie, but because they are in the genre of sci-fi, horror, or retaining any elements of fantasy, they are guaranteed to become a franchise. RoboCop should have been one movie, and yet it's a franchise. Ghostbusters should have been one movie, and yet it's a franchise. Jaws should have been one movie, and yet it's somehow a franchise. Hell, even Star Wars, a movie that was supposed to be one movie, is one of the biggest franchises of all time. So even if Terminator ended with 1, there would still be a bunch of people who liked the movie more than enough to the point where a sequel had to have been made. Hell, there were several comic books based off of the movie in the 80s, well before T2 went into pre-production. Not to mention, everyone believes that Genisys ruins the first 2 movies because of it destroying the original timeline. What they're trying to do was the next logical step in the franchise, while also not destroying it. The original 2 movies are done. They have been done for over 30 years. That story is and always will be over. Other sequels try to expand upon the original story, but more times than not, fail to do anything worthy of living up to the legacy and being a necessary continuation. Genisys was going to take that step into bringing the franchise into another direction outside of the story from the first 2 movies by creating a bridge connecting the past and future, utilizing the present as the foundation in order to tell a new story. But no, people never gave the film a chance, and because of it, it was targeted and attacked for something that it never was. And I could really blame the fans for this. To all of you boomers in the community, you really are gatekeeping, saying everything after 2 sucks, because you want new fans to have the same opinions as you do. It's like you're a machine, and everything has to be just like you by enforcing these bullshit rules to them. You have to be like us, think like us, and like and dislike the same movies as us, otherwise you're not a true Terminator fan. I think Kyle's original description of Terminators suit you well. You can't be reasoned with, bargained with, or show pity, remorse, or fear. All you know is hate. Hate that if someone says something that doesn't reflect your belief, they are your enemy that needs to be terminated from the community. This is why I feel envious towards the Star Wars community, because even though the sequel trilogy has their problems, and the prequels too, lest we forget, there are still a large amount of people who like and defend those films. Hell, it's the same thing with the Amazing Spider-Man movies that still have its fans despite me believing that the second film is the worst comic book movie ever. I feel like that is one thing that is missing within the Terminator community. People sharing varied opinions and liking films that are hated by the collective majority. That's not to say people have, but when most videos about Genisys on this site are nothing but negative reviews, it becomes hard to actually get the opposing opinion across without getting trampled on by hundreds of Terminator boomers saying that I'm what's wrong with the franchise. No, dingbats, you're what's wrong with the franchise. Because of how dense their media literacy skills are, most fans don't know about the Salvation comic continuation and how that worked out so well to close off that storyline. So why couldn't Genisys pull off the same thing once the trilogy was a bust? In fact, I strongly believe that the Terminator community themselves did the franchise in. All of you annoying brats begging for a future war movie and this and that, and when Genisys actually gave you fleshed out future war scenes amongst other new and interesting ideas, you turned your back on the film almost immediately and shit all over it still to this day because it looked too familiar, when you guys were complaining the exact opposite thing for Salvation when that movie came out. It also didn't help that Genisys was going to be the first part of a trilogy, which probably would have guaranteed more future war scenes. Hell, maybe a future war movie in its entirety. But you, in your impatient manner to time, said, fuck all of this movie sucks because it looks like my beloved Holy Grail. So take a look at what Paramount shits on your dish in less than 5 years. Yeah, Dark Fate. This is your fault that the franchise went from 6 feet under to a motherfucking 12 feet. So please, sit in your own shit, because it's your fault why things are the way they are in this community. In conclusion to the rant that I know will get my fan license revoked, not that I want it anyway, the Terminator community are full of toxic boomers that hate anything that is different to what they like and will pretty much go on a persecution tirade if someone even dares to admit liking something that they don't. And if you think my opinion is wrong, or that I'm over-exaggerating, or that I'm accusing things about the fandom out of my ass, I have one thing to say to you. Okay, boomer. God, Jesus Christ. This movie could have been the next best thing for Terminator. While I do like the film and think it is the third best film in the franchise, it is nowhere near as flawless as the first two. But everything I have stated in this video is a genuine reason for why I like this film, and I just wanted to share my own opinion about a film that virtually everyone has turned their back on. That doesn't mean the movie was a bomb. Sure, the domestic box office wasn't great, only making $85 million compared to its $150 million budget, but the overall box office for the film was the second best-selling movie in the series post T2, only being $1 million short to tie with T3. And the fact that this film has the lowest budget in the franchise since T1, a movie that had no budget. And sure, you could argue most of the money was garnered by the Asian market, but at least there was an audience for this kind of film. enough to not only make the film's initial budget back, but to make more than enough money to continue the trilogy. And before you say, the Chinese market gobbles everything up, they don't care about the product itself, take a look at the box office for Dark Fate and Salvation, films that barely made any money, especially overseas. Genisys was the next step in the franchise, both logically and financially speaking, familiarizing the audience with what came before, and then advancing to the next level of where the franchise should go in terms of storytelling, breaking the meta of a plot that has been beaten into the ground for over 30 years, and creating a new plot line that would have been well-deserved and respected. Unfortunately, people being impatient, or not having a full understanding of the film, has resulted in the series to stay in that first level of storytelling indefinitely. But that doesn't mean the film has no impact to its viewers. This movie has been on my mind for 10 years, and since then, some of my ideas about Skynet has been based on this film. The appearance of the T-3000 John Connor and the Skynet AI embodiment, the T-5000, being a part of Shareverse lore just shows the impact and inspiration that a content creator such as myself got something out of this movie. And maybe there are people that are just like me, who were inspired to continue where that story went. To end things off, I want to speak to you, the viewer. If you like this movie, don't be afraid to share your opinion, because hey, that's what my video is here for. Sharing mine and encouraging others to speak their mind within the online community. And for those who think all of my statements are bullshit and make no sense, that's totally okay. I understand this video will get a lot of flack because of my unpopular opinion. But take the rose-tinted glasses off that ironically see the movie as a pile of shit, and just maybe you'll gain an appreciation for a movie trilogy that could have been. Give the movie a second chance, because you just might appreciate the little things a lot more than the first time around. But as of now, I still dream and plan to create stories on what could have been a pretty ambitious trilogy. I honestly assumed this video was going to be 40 minutes. Apparently not, but if you liked the video, please give it a like and maybe subscribe for other Shareverse content and video essays. But at the end of the day, I'm just glad Genisys is not the last Terminator film, nor is it the worst. With that, I'm AJ, and I'll see you all in the next one.